And then I wake up on the floor in the kitchen like, He goes, old enough to talk to me like a man, old enough to get your ass beat like one.
And then I wake up on the floor in the kitchen like he goes, old enough to talk to me like a man, old enough to get your ass beat like one. Rick Harrison built a car empire worth millions. Over 30 classic vehicles filled his garages. His prized 1940 Chevy Deluxe sat alongside Ferraris and NASCAR tributes. But then the bills started piling up. $65,000 monthly alimony payments. His own mother suing him for $500,000, legal fees crushing his cash flow. In 2025, something changed. Rick started making strange decisions about his beloved collection. He passed on a $100,000 Ferrari. He lowballed on cars she once would have bought instantly. What's really happening behind the Pawn Star's fortune? Rick Harrison was just 8 when his world broke apart. It started in 1973 lying in bed at the family's home in San Diego when his head suddenly buzzed like tangled power lines. His body locked up, his tongue tore like hamburger meat. When it was over, he couldn't walk. Doctors called it focal onset aware seizures, but to Rick, it just meant pain. It happened every month for the next 10 years. The seizures damaged his muscles so badly he sometimes couldn't get out of bed for weeks. Ice packs wrapped around his legs. Sometimes he missed more than 200 days of school in a single year. He spent his childhood trapped between hospital visits and silent rooms, listening to the buzz in his skull and waiting for the next one to hit. While other kids played baseball, Rick read books. His mom brought him the Great Brain series from the library, and he fell in love with a boy named Tom, who pulled clever money-making schemes in small-town Utah. Rick devoured all 8 books in less than 2 weeks. He wanted to be Tom. He wanted to win. Then came history books. By age 12, Rick was reading about 18th century naval warfare, ancient coins, and obscure battles that most adults had never even heard of. Alone in his room, sweating from seizures, he unknowingly trained his brain for the job he'd become famous for decades later. He could spot details most people missed. He remembered everything. But life outside that bedroom was cruel. At Taft Middle School, the bullying never stopped. Kids mocked him for being different, for missing school, for twitching in his seat or looking pale and strange. He couldn't play sports. He couldn't run. He lived in fear of seizing in front of everyone. So, he kept his head down and studied human behavior instead. Every insult taught him how people think. Every lonely lunch trained him to read faces and see weaknesses, what others called social rejection. Rick turned into survival training. Then everything collapsed. In 1981, when Rick was 16, his family lost everything. His mom, Joanne, had built a strong real estate business in the 70s, but the recession hit hard. Mortgage interest rates exploded to 18%. The housing market died overnight. Rick's dad, Richard, had just left the Navy after 20 years to help with the business. It was the worst timing imaginable. They lost $1 million. They had only $5,000 left in their bank account, barely enough to start over. So, they left California behind. They packed up, drove across the desert, and landed in Las Vegas, hoping the lights would save them. It was a full reset. By then, Rick had already dropped out of 10th grade. School didn't make sense to him anymore. He was making $2,000 a week selling fake Gucci bags out of the San Diego garment district. That's over $7,000 a week today. He was 15. He'd buy knockoff bags for $30 and sell them for $300. When the competition undercut him, he switched to fake jeans. He built a whole underground empire while most teens were still playing arcade games. His dad was furious when he quit school, but he couldn't argue with the money. It lasted nearly 2 years. Then the market dried up and Rick started looking for the next hustle. In 1982, something even bigger happened. His girlfriend Kim got pregnant. Rick was only 17, but then tragedy struck. She had a miscarriage. Most teenage couples wouldn't survive that kind of loss, but Rick and Kim got married anyway. Just months later, she got pregnant again. On April 27, 1983, their son Corey was born. Rick was 18.2 years later. Adam arrived. But life with two babies and no money quickly became too much. In 1985, Kim walked out. She dropped the kids off and never came back. Rick was just 20, now a single father with two toddlers and a pile of unpaid bills. He had to pawn his comic book collection just to keep the lights on. Every day was survival. Vegas didn't offer easy answers. Rick sold bootleg VHS tapes on the street. He flipped cars and shady deals. In one stunt, he even used a winch truck to steal a car from a dealership service bay, driving off like he owned it. He got arrested for selling fake designer goods. He ran newspaper route scams. It wasn't pretty, but it kept food on the table. Every hustle sharpened his instincts. Every shady deal taught him how to assess value, spot lies, and read desperation. He was building a skill set without even knowing it. Back in the hospital waiting rooms, Rick started buying antique coins. He was 12 the first time he walked into a shop and picked up a Civil War-era piece. Something clicked. The weight, the patina, the story behind the metal. It all made sense. He bought more. He read everything. He studied how coins were minted, how artifacts aged, how fakes looked under light. His memory was perfect. His obsession with history mixed with real-world hustling created something rare, a kid who could both charm you and outthink you at the same time. That rare mix came from something darker. Rick had lost his sister Sherry when he was just a toddler. She was 6 when she died from health complications. The family never spoke much about it, but Rick felt the loss in the silence that followed. It changed how they all moved through the world. His parents carried the grief with them every day. Rick learned early that life could end without warning. That lesson stayed with him. He didn't trust happiness. He planned for disaster. And that's why when life broke down in 1981, he didn't fall apart. He adapted. He remembered. He rebuilt. In April 1981, Rick Harrison was just 16 when he arrived in Las Vegas with his family, and barely $5,000 left in their name. His father's dreams of a Navy retirement had collapsed, and the desert city became their last hope. Rick got a job bussing tables in a casino, scrubbing dishes for $335 an hour while still attending high school. But by night, he was doing something else entirely. He was repossessing cars from people who had stopped paying their loans, driving through dangerous neighborhoods where one wrong move could get him hurt. Some nights he earned more doing that than headed all month cleaning tables. His parents opened a tiny coin shop on Las Vegas Boulevard, just 300 square feet, barely big enough to move around. That's where Rick saw what desperation really looked like. He watched gamblers stumble in and pawn their wedding rings for $20 loans, often at just 13 cents on the dollar. He memorized their faces. He started learning the game and soon began selling counterfeit designer bags on the side, pulling in $2,000 a week, far more than school could ever offer. By 10th grade, he dropped out. Vegas was teaching him faster. But Rick wanted more than coins and fake Gucci. He wanted a pawn license. The problem was Las Vegas law only allowed one license per 50,000 people. In 1981, Pawn Stars wasn't just a show anymore. It was a Las Vegas attraction. But behind the scenes, the family wasn't as solid as they looked on TV. In 2021, everything cracked wide open. Rick's own mother, Joanne Harrison, filed a lawsuit against him. She said that when her husband, Richard Old Man Harrison, was in a coma, Rick tricked her into giving up her 51% ownership of the shop. Joanne claimed Rick stopped sending her the $25,000 monthly payments she'd been getting after Old Man's death in 2018. She also said Rick was hiding more than $500,000 in cash and silver her husband had stashed away. In March 2022, she went further and got a temporary restraining order to stop Rick from touching the family assets. At the same time, Rick and Corey weren't getting along either. Tensions flared on set. They disagreed on how to run things. The happy family people saw on screen was slowly unraveling. Rick had written a book in 2011 called License to Pawn. He talked about his wild early years, his deep love for math, and how he built the shop from scratch. He shared stories about the craziest items that ever came through the door. That same white Ford Bronco came up again. The one he turned down for $1.3 million after it had once been offered $500,000. Rick knew its value. He just didn't want that kind of attention. He also talked about the pieces he would never sell. A Patriot Super Bowl ring, 3 Olympic bronze medals, a 1490 samurai sword, and an original Ioma battle plan. For Rick, those weren't just collectibles. They were history. But things got risky in 2015. The IRS came knocking. Rick's merchandise business was booming. They were selling Pawn Stars, mugs, shirts, and even replica items based on the show. But investigators found over $500,000 in silver stashed in a family trust that hadn't been reported. That triggered a full federal audit. Agents froze accounts and took records. History Channel panicked. Their top-rated show was suddenly at risk. Filming nearly stopped. Rick had to hire lawyers and pay heavy fines. He spent months restructuring everything just to keep the doors open. And then in 2018, something happened that reminded people why Rick was still the best at what he did. A man brought in what looked like a NASA rocket engine. The seller said it came from Apollo mission surplus. Rick didn't just nod along. He examined serial numbers, identified stamp codes, and contacted NASA archives. He confirmed it was real. A training engine used to prepare astronauts for lunar missions in the 60s and 70s. Rick bought it for $100,000. A few weeks later, he sold it at an aerospace auction for over $1 million. It was one of the best deals in Pawn Stars history. And Rick did it not with luck, but with skill, patience, and years of study. In 1981, Rick Harrison's parents opened a small pawn shop in Las Vegas called the Gold and Silver Pawn. It was supposed to be a family business. His father, Richard, the man everyone would later call the Old Man, had spent 20 years in the Navy. His mother, Joanne, worked quietly behind the scenes. Rick was still young then, just learning the trade. Over time, the shop grew. Then, in 2009, everything changed. The family stepped into the spotlight when Pawn Stars hit the History Channel. It exploded overnight, pulling in millions of viewers. People loved the banter, the haggling, the old items. They saw laughter, deals, and history lessons. But behind the counters and the cameras, things were starting to break. Not just in business, in the family. By 2018, the Old Man was gone. Richard Harrison died on June 25 after fighting Parkinson's disease for years. He was 77. At his funeral, the flag-draped casket honored his Navy service. He left behind 3 sons, 10 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. But his will had one shocking line. He wrote that he intentionally and with full knowledge failed to provide for his youngest son, Christopher. No explanation, just silence. The bulk of his $5 million went to Joanne and Rick, but it wouldn't bring peace. In February 2022, Joanne, now 81, sued her own son. She said Rick had tricked her during her weakest moment back in 2000 or 2001 when she was lying in a coma in Valley Hospital SICU. According to her, while she was fighting for her life, Rick brought her papers she couldn't understand and got her to sign away her 51% ownership of the pawn shop. That wasn't just paperwork. It was the majority share of the empire she and her husband built from scratch. Rick said she was being manipulated by outsiders. But the lawsuit revealed something deeper than just contracts. It was about betrayal. Joanne also claimed Rick had hidden money from her. Before Richard died, he had secretly gathered $500,000 worth of silver and $100,000 in cash. After his death, Joanne inherited his 49% stake in the business. She said Rick never gave her a full picture of the assets. At first, from 2018 to 2020, she received $25,000 per month to cover her expenses. Then Rick dropped it to $20,000. Then in March 2020, as the pandemic began, the money stopped completely. Joanne went to court. A judge issued a restraining order blocking Rick from selling